Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Jess Wyatt. I'm the Bureau Chief for Long-Term Services and Supports at the Ohio Department of Medicaid. I want to thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate and look forward to this discussion. And please, as Jennifer suggested, as we go along, please ask questions. You're welcome to wait till the end of the presentation, but I'd rather you just ask as we go along.
I filled that out, but where did I put it? Oh, here it is. My arthritis in my hand is so bad, it's hard for me to write.
What?
My arthritis in my hand. It hurts when I grip a pen.
Would you be interested in this speaker again? Would you be interested in this speaker again?
Oh, from all these other things.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I just put all of it.
It's like, oh.
Me and computers,
Yeah,
user
sorry.
error. Never experienced that. Okay, so Jennifer had asked me to talk about the caregiver rule. Many of you may be familiar with it. The caregiver rule coming out of the pandemic, as many of you may know, prior to the pandemic, parents of minor children being the paid caregiver was generally speaking not allowed. During the pandemic, there were flexibilities placed in what we call the Appendix K authority. This is an amendment to the waiver application that the state submits to CMS, our federal partner. We had to do a permanent amendment, or several amendments actually, to make those flexibilities permanent on an ongoing basis after the end of the pandemic. And the caregiver rule is a direct result of us making some of those flexibilities permanent. In the pandemic, there were some, but there really weren't a lot of parameters around the flexibility. So in the caregiver rule, we did place some parameters as well. Okay. And we're going to talk about a few different things here: applicability, definitions, program exceptions, some of those parameters, and a couple other items. So again, through the process of making these amendments and the rulemaking for the caregiver rule, through that process, we really did have quite a bit of stakeholder feedback. We held several different virtual meetings. We received a lot of written feedback. Some individuals and organizations just reached out proactively to us to give us their opinion, and so really quite a bit of feedback on both the rule and the amendments. And it started in the spring of last year. I think our first virtual meeting was in March, so it's just over a year ago. And then there were formal feedback too, through the rulemaking process and through the amendments. We received several formal, not just kind of like this informal feedback, but a lot of formal feedback as well. And the rule is really a result. There were several changes through the process from the original rule to the one we have today. There really have been several changes to it. And if any of you had feedback for us during that time, I want to say thank you. Really appreciate all the feedback we received. Okay, and both the IO, the level 1, and the self waivers did allow previously individuals with legal authority other than parents of minor children and spouses to serve as a direct care worker for certain waiver services. Examples of legal authority include a power of attorney and a guardianship. The direct care worker rule, as you may already know, allows children and spouses to serve as a direct care worker of the waiver, personal care or nursing services, and also some other relatives designated or appointed legal authority to also serve as a direct care worker for those services. And that's the rule number, if you're not familiar. That's Ohio Administrative Code, Rule 51-60-44-32. And the rule is outlined in the following manner. Paragraph A talks about applicability. B is definitions. C and D are exceptions. E goes into some of the parameters for parents of minor children and spouses. Paragraph F is relatives and those with legal authority to make decisions and those conditions and parameters. G is limitation, and then other conditions is H and I. So applicability for the IO waiver, it impacts homemaker personal care, participant directed and provided through an agency, and waiver nursing provided through an agency. Level 1, it's homemaker personal care services, again, participant directed and provided through an agency. And then for the self waiver, it's participant directed homemaker personal care. To go into some of the differences, and I won't go through each one, but maybe just highlight a few of these. So Appendix K was a standalone waiver amendment appendix that many states utilized, and it again allowed some of these flexibilities, such as parents of minor children being a direct care worker. And a direct care worker is a person providing hands-on care to an individual receiving Medicaid waiver services. Extraordinary care. So this is an important one. One of the federal requirements that we have to operate under is we have to ensure that we only provide services through a parent of a minor child or a spouse if they need extraordinary care. And it's an extreme example, I know, but I'll give you an example. So a newborn infant cannot bathe themselves, right? We all know this. So bathing a newborn infant would not be considered extraordinary care because all infants, regardless of disability, cannot bathe themselves. Whereas a 17-year-old, generally speaking, it's expected that they can bathe themselves. So if you needed to bathe a 17-year-old, that would be considered extraordinary care. And there's more to come, but we did develop an extraordinary care instrument. It's a tool, it's basically an assessment that determines whether extraordinary care is needed or not. So financial management service, that's the fiscal intermediary for those individuals who self-direct their own care. And to touch on parent, it's an adoptive, biological, or step-parent of an individual. A relative could include children, grandparents, grandchildren, great-grandparents, great-grandchildren, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, step relation, and parents of an individual above the age of 17. A legal representative is a person or entity who has a legal standing to make decisions on behalf of another, for example, a guardian who has been appointed by the court, or an individual who has power of attorney granted. So, some exceptions. So, the rule is considered a unified rule, meaning it impacts really all the different waiver programs across the 3 departments. And so the Department of Developmental Disabilities, the Department of Medicaid, and the Department of Aging all worked on this rule, and it impacts each department and their waiver programs. And so what these particular exceptions do is to allow long-standing program variances to continue. So, for example, in IO Self in Level 1, pre-pandemic authorization for payment to legal reps, guardians, and other relatives permitted under DOD's waivers can continue. Because if we didn't have these exceptions in there, then those long-standing program differences would not continue. So that's the importance of this unless otherwise permitted language in these exceptions. Then these continue. So for example, allowing an agency owned by an individual's legal representative to serve an adult, which has been a long-standing practice, but not a minor or child or spouse. Let's talk a little bit more about parents of minor children and spouses. And again, that's really probably the primary point of this rule is to allow parents of minors and spouses to be the direct care worker, to be paid to be the direct care worker. And there are some conditions that have to be met. There cannot be another willing and able provider or direct care worker available to provide the home and community-based service waiver services to that individual. The point of this is that this rule is designed to help address provider shortages. So that's the idea behind that clause. And then ODM DOD or their designee has determine the health and safety needs of the individual can be insured. And we talked about it earlier, but again, for parents and minor children and spouses, there is an extraordinary care instrument that also has to be applied and make sure extraordinary care is met. So the parent of a minor child or spouse must be employed through an agency provider or through participant-directed services through the financial management service I mentioned earlier, which directs the payment for self-directed care. And so contact and visit requirements. Individuals must agree to and cooperate with monthly case management contacts. These contacts can be a combination of phone and in person with no more than 60 calendar days between visits. The parent of a minor child or spouse participates in contact and visit requirements prescribed in their person-centered service plan. There's maximum hours. So for a parent of a minor, it's 40 hours a week. Same for a spouse. And in both scenarios, there can be an exception process. And maximum hours for relatives and parent of an adult child is 40 hours with the exception you see here. And this goes into the exception process for maximum hours. For the DODB operated waivers, the requesting county board would provide the specific hours approved and indicate that they submitted the request and the process or the rule has been followed. And the supporting documentation includes the ISP, the extraordinary care instrument, the provider search information, and any other information relevant to the request. Relatives. So the direct care worker does allow other relatives to provide direct care services for individuals above the age of 17. Relatives are considered, again, parents of adult children, grandparents, grandchildren, great-grandparents, great-grandchildren, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, and step relations. So, adult children, again, that same group, may provide just the services described in the applicability section that we already discussed. DOD, again, long-standing program variances will continue to allow other relatives to provide HCBS waiver services for adult relatives, as has occurred for a long time prior to the pandemic. This is an important point because for other waivers, that has not always been the case prior to the pandemic. This is really between the departments, this is actually one of the bigger differences. So a parent of an individual, again, above the age of 17 may provide services while holding one of these different types of statuses. Some limitations. So waiver services may not be provided to an individual by the foster parent of the individual or an agency in which the foster parent of the individual has an ownership interest. Services provided by a parent or minor child may not be provided for respite purposes. A direct care worker providing services described in A, applicability, may not verify service provision on behalf of that individual. A direct care worker may not receive payment from a source for activity other than the direct care for the individual during the time authorized. A direct care worker may not provide care to a person other than the authorized individual during the time there was Medicaid billed hours. And for participant-directed services, if an individual chooses to designate a representative through the fiscal management service, the FMS, then that FMS designated representative may not serve as the direct care worker. And so some other conditions. The person-centered plan will document the conditions we previously discussed that this rule are met. And really, if you think about it, the person-centered plan should be documenting a whole bunch of stuff, so nothing abnormal here. The transition process has already occurred, so I'm going to skip past that. And then paragraph J of the rule, decision by ODM DOT or their designee related to whether someone qualifies under this rule to serve as a provider or direct care worker is not subject to appeal rights under a separate section of the Ohio Administrative Code. Okay, so that's a quick presentation there, the caregiver rule. I imagine many of you are familiar, I'm sure not all. What questions do you have? And I do understand there was a kind of question that was different than the caregiver rule earlier too. So you can certainly ask questions on the caregiver rule, but if you have a different question, that's okay too.
And, all right.
Yeah, Becky?
Yeah. Give me the mic. So I don't get yelled at.
Okay, as Nyoka made you aware, we providers received a letter 2 days ago from Medicaid. About 75% of providers received this letter saying that we did not go into the P&M portal and make corrections, that we would be terminated as of yesterday. We were unable to go into the system. Some of us spent 4 or 5 hours trying to do this, and we want to know what's going on with this thing.
Okay. Well, I do appreciate the question, and that's a question I'm going to have to take back, though, because I do apologize. And just to give you some context, the area that I manage at the department is a little more policy programmatic in nature. And so, for example, the area that I help manage works on the home and community-based waivers, those amendments, these rules. We have a couple that ODM operates directly, and then we provide oversight to DOD and ODA for the waivers that they operate directly. Home health, private duty nursing, hospice, nursing facilities, case management, the home choice program. Those are all things that in my area work on. The P&M and things related to P&M, there's a different area in ODM that manages that. So I just, off the top, I really don't know the answer to your question, and I apologize for that. And I apologize for any confusion it may have caused as well. But I promise you, I will take that back, and I should be able to connect with Jennifer early next week to figure out exactly what that means and what's going on. So.
And then will you post something then and send out an email, or what will you do? How will you let us know that that's been taken care of?
Well, so there could be a couple different things. I need to explore exactly what the issue is, why this went out, what it means, because honestly, I really don't know. And so I apologize for that again, but I'm really not familiar with this letter, so I'm going to have to find out what it means. I can certainly get a response back to Jennifer, who I would assume has a mailing list for everyone. But if not, we can certainly work through what it means and get communications out.
Honestly, when I get one of these, I get messages all the time from you guys, and I look at the bottom and the phone number is 686-1516. I know that's the provider support for Medicaid. I'm going to blow it off because I'm going to assume it doesn't apply to me because I'm a DoD provider, and my hotline is 733-1760, something like that. But anyways, so there needs to be some way that these are marked, yes, this is for you. This applies to DoD providers. Or no, hey, it doesn't apply to DoD providers. Instead of sending us all into a panic of what are we supposed to do, who do we contact, where do we go?
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Becky. I appreciate that feedback. It's good feedback. When I talk to the other area, I will bring this up too, because I mean, to me, that makes sense. It's reasonable. And again, I'm sorry I don't know more about it, but this is really the first I've heard of it. But I certainly will explore it when I get back, yes. Thank you, Becky. What other questions does anyone have? Or comments, please?
Okay, I do. So you're a parent of a minor, and this is out of my world, my world, okay? My son's 35. And you cannot find another provider. Are you still holding me to 40 hours a week?
Yes, the limitation is 40 hours per week. That's correct. Now, I will say it can be less because it depends on the person-centered service plan. So, say, for example, the authorized hours are only 30. The rule doesn't automatically grant 10 additional hours in that scenario. So it can be less than 40 depending on what's authorized through the plan, but otherwise the answer is yes, you would be limited.
Okay.
Now again, there is an exception process, and you can work with the county board and go through DOD if that's needed, but the general answer there is yes.
So is that mandated through the state? I mean, is that mandated through the state? Or
Yeah, it
okay.
is through this caregiver rule. That's correct.
Okay, is that because the state is responsible for the overtime pay?
Actually, I think there are several considerations as far as why the 40-hour limitation is in the rule. Certainly, oversight of the health and safety of all individuals involved is part of it. And I certainly understand that often parents really are the very best caregiver, there's no doubt about it. But there can be some exceptions to that. And so we have certain kind of broad requirements we have to meet for CMS, our federal partner. So I gave you a specific requirement earlier. For example, the extraordinary care requirement. That is not a broad requirement. It is very specific. We have to do that. But we have other, what CMS calls assurances that we have to meet as a state to CMS. And these assurances are broad, like the health and safety of the individuals in the program. And so we do develop different parameters around the rule and other rules to try our best to meet those assurances. And not every state, but quite a few states who have moved forward to allow parents to be reimbursed to provide care for their minor children have a very similar requirement. Again, not every state, but most.
Okay, I'm gonna jump to adults. I have several friends that have adult children that have switched over to HPC and from Ohio Shared Living, okay? And they're also being held to the 40-hour rule, whereas the rule says they can go up to 60 without prior authorization.
And I apologize. On this one, I may have to punt to DODD. I do apologize, but the nuances between the homemaker personal care and shared living, I'd probably start to get a little out of my depth.
And they're being told that the state has mandated no overtime, and that's why they can't even go up to the 60 hours.
I'm sorry to punt there, nyoka.
That's okay. Hello? Okay, so this again should be based on the assessed need of the person, and the only rule that we have, the only limitation is the overtime rule. So the overtime rule does state that the county should work with the provider and the team to limit overtime costs, but providers should be, all of the providers should be meeting the needs of that person and working toward, keeping costs down. However, the overtime is the 60-hour, so it is, we're working within that overtime rule, which does allow the 60 hours. Okay. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, nyoka.
That's very happy.
Anyone else have questions or comments? And Becky, you're free to ask a third if you want.
Oh, I don't have anything left. I'm sorry. Those are all the ones that were sent to me, so.
Oh, well, very good. Well, thanks for sharing.
Oh, you want to announce that you're going to be coming to my church?
Do you remember the day? I will be attending Becky's her events. I'm not sure of the date.
I don't know whether I have my calendar or not. Yes, I do. I will let you know. Hold this, please. We're looking at. You must be June 20th at 6:30 at my church. You will be coming to talk, and we sit at a table, a round table, and we just chit chat back and forth and throw questions out. And then in July, I have Pete Moore and Scott Merckx coming from Opera. So,
Thank you, Becky.
thank you. Good advertisement. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Feel free. We do have a microphone. If you have any announcements too, like Becky's, that's fine.
Wait a second, I think you're turned off.
I'll ask you one.
Oh,
I think you just turned me off.
no, you. My thing won't work. Just if she has one, if we can get the microphone on. There it goes.
Okay. Is it on?
Nope.
No.
Push it again.
Hello? No.
I can probably hear you. If you ask your
Yeah,
question,
I'm
I can
close.
repeat it for the crowd.
So, you're part of long-term care ongoing support?
Yep.
Okay. So,
when it comes to patient liability,
Ooh, yeah.
I went through this, not this year, not last year, but Dusty suddenly had a patient liability of $400 and some. He is on SSDI now that his, excuse me for saying this, but he was the one that abused him, so he's a sperm donor, okay? So he suddenly had a patient liability. I called my SSA, I called multiple people, nobody could explain it to me, they just said pay it. And I refused because I wanted to know what was going on. I did talk to someone in Columbus, Michael, who was long-term care, ongoing support, and he explained to me that in Franklin County, there's a whole process of if you pay it, then you submit it, then you get reimbursed, which is silly. But as it turned out, somewhere along the line, Dustin
The field.
became a normal person. He was no longer a disabled adult child. There was a box that was unchecked at Medicaid or at Social Security, one of those two entities, and no longer was he considered a disabled adult child. Once, it took me months to get this straightened out, but then he was finally a disabled adult child again and no longer had a patient liability. So how often does this occur that clients have a patient liability?
Tell me how many we found.
And we started asking other parents, anybody have a patient liability? There's multiple people across the state that have it,
That shouldn't have it.
which we don't really understand why they have it. Some of them were in error, some of them did get fixed, and because they were just unmarked. Part of that problem was the Dear Michael person is in Franklin County. He was just kind of guiding other people, and he got in trouble for it,
For helping.
for helping people realize that they didn't really have a patient liability. So my question, I think, is, I forgot what my question was now. This patient liability for people who are, let's say 15 years old, they're Down syndrome, their parents made a good living, they were never on SSI, and then the father dies when they're 15. Suddenly they're on SSDI, and suddenly they have a patient liability. Some of them $900 a month that they have to pay before Medicaid will pay. Why does that exist?
Well, okay, well, thank you for your question, and sorry to hear about the challenging experience that you went through. So a couple things. One, I am in long-term care services and supports. This is actually a Medicaid eligibility issue, which is not actually my area, so I apologize. But generally speaking, Medicaid as a whole is, for individuals who really have no other source of a payer, right? No other payer. It's really for individuals with a certain level of income and a certain level of assets. And then there's all kinds of exceptions. We're here talking about HCBS waivers, and the HCBS waivers have it is easier to be eligible for Medicaid if one is enrolled on the HCBS waiver often than it is for someone who is not. And so
These are all enrolled.
Yeah, and so it gets really extremely complicated. And I apologize. I'm probably not the best person to answer Medicaid eligibility type questions like that. But I can certainly take your feedback back to that group and make sure they know there's several people who are facing challenges, mistakes where maybe they have patient liability and they shouldn't have. It could be Social Security, but if it's Medicaid, then that's certainly something we need to work on. But Medicaid really is only made eligible for certain individuals. And And that's really part of it. If you don't know, Medicaid itself as a whole really is one of the largest budget items in any state across the country. CMS provides federal requirements, they provide a federal framework, we have to get federal approvals from CMS, but generally speaking, states design their own Medicaid program within that framework, within those approvals, and it's really because the state pays for a significant share of every Medicaid dollar, which is different than Medicare, for example. We all pay taxes, of course, but otherwise the state really doesn't contribute to Medicare. But in Medicaid, the state is a significant, state and other local sources, frankly, too. That's especially important here, but it's not the federal dollar, it's the state or local dollars that are paying for it. So states design the programs differently. And it can actually make it very hard to compare Medicaid from state to state, because you're not always looking at an apples to apples comparison. But, yeah. So apologies, I don't have more, but yeah, thank you. I will take it back.
Want me to tell them we went to state? Okay, Carol and I have been working on this for like she said, forever. And we went to Columbus to the head of Medicaid down there, and they said, no, this is a federal problem. So we went to Sherrod Brown's office, and we talked with his
His legislative aides.
administrator. And we've been trying to get in with Sherrod Brown himself. These kids that parents died when they were like 15 years old and went straight to the SSDI, had their parent not died before they got to the age of 18, they would have qualified for SSI. And once you qualify for SSI before the age of 22, you never have a patient liability. Never have a patient liability. But because these kids, their dad died when they were younger, didn't qualify for that. Okay, so under the Pickle Amendment, our kids that got SSI is where they fall, and they will never have that patient liability. Problem with the patient liability is with a special income level of $1,783, you can't make more than that. I mean, it goes up every January with the cost of living, with the COLAs. So every year when that goes up, your patient liability also goes up, so you can never get ahead. So somebody that gets SSDI after the age of 18, they can make money, they can save money, they can keep money, they can, no, not really keep money, Medicaid rules, stable accounts. But the kids with the patient liability, they can never, ever get ahead.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's our issue.
Any other questions or comments?
Does that make sense? Don't hand me a mic.
Well, I think it's a little early, but
Oh, I had to say something more. It's not Medicaid. Don't think that you want to go around in circles, and that's exactly what he did. Oops. Did I say that on Facebook? Okay, I think we're done.